Edition. Listen now on BBC Sounds.
Christine and I are three beautiful children diagnosed with autism.
When we first got told, I was so upset about it because I didn't understand it.
What gets to me with them all is, will they ever know how loved they are? We're still trying to work out what it all means for our family and our future. Autism is a part of who they are now. Why would I want to take away a part of my children? Paddy and Christine McGuinness, Our Family and Autism. Wednesday the 1st of December on BBC One and iPlayer.
This is BBC One in Yorkshire. Now the BBC News with Hugh Edwards and Phil Bodmer at 10 o'clock.
Tonight at 10, the House of Commons votes on the future funding of social care in England. The vote has been called just a few seconds ago. MPs have been debating whether the plans are generous, as Boris Johnson says, or daylight robbery, in Labour's opinion. The amended plans, according to some charities, will be especially unfair to the less well-off.
Concerns over care comes from Boris Johnson's own side too. The government faces anxiety on many different fronts.
Yes, we'll be back with Laura for the latest. Also tonight, a less than straightforward day for the Prime Minister.
With fantastic broadband.
Mr Johnson loses his way in a speech to the UK's business leaders about his levelling up strategy.
Forgive me.
Police in Wisconsin named the man that they detained after a vehicle drove through a parade, causing 5 deaths and many injuries. And we report on Austria's full national lockdown, one of several European countries where COVID infection rates are still rising sharply.
And on the north, still unable to move on despite plans for HS2 being abandoned. We hear from residents in South Yorkshire. And running through the night, former Leeds Rhinos player Kevin Sinfield on his latest challenge for motor neurone disease.
Good evening. The House of Commons is voting right now on plans to reform social care in England. Boris Johnson says the plans are incredibly generous and that they finally tackle a long-standing problem. But a late change has drawn criticism from the opposition and has also upset some Conservative MPs. The basic plan is that payments for personal care will be capped at £86,000 over a person's lifetime. But last week, ministers announced that support payments from local councils would not count towards that cap, and the result of that, according to charities, is that the less well-off will be unfairly hit. Our political editor Laura Kuensberg has the latest.
A mother's care for her daughter. Decades on, Roma's daughter helps care for her. The 83-year-old who has dementia had to sell the family home to pay for the full-time care she now needs.
She worked night and day to have her own home. I mean, my mum would have been the Tory post girl. She never took a penny in benefits. She worked. She must have paid income tax for 50 years. And everything she worked for has gone because she's been ill. And that is just wrong.
The Prime Minister claims the new system will protect families just like Lorraine's from enormous bills those who need intense care can face if they can afford to contribute. But there's a fear the wealthiest will benefit the most. If someone has a house worth £120,000, they'll still have to pay £86,000 themselves, even though they qualify for some council help. And they'd be left with just over a quarter of the value of their home. But look at this. If an individual has a house worth £500,000, they'll have to pay the £86,000, yet then will keep over 80% of the value of their house to pass on.
The social care reforms.
Some of Boris Johnson's own MPs fear his big platform plan for social care is unfair.
And
at a time when some wonder if Downing Street's really concentrating.
And Tony, yesterday I went, as we all must, to Peppa Pig World,
An appearance today won't have calmed those nerves or fears about the proposals which MPs will vote on tonight.
They're much better than the existing system, because under the existing system, nobody gets any support if they have assets of £23,000 or more. Now you get support if you have £100,000 or less.
But after losing his place, he was later asked,
Frankly, is everything okay?
I think that people got the vast majority of the points I wanted to make, and I thought it went over well.
this government is the first to act to reform care after years of promises. Overall, it should mean billions extra and more people getting help. Yet the opposition wants to make the most of Tory nerves about the specifics and vote them down tonight.
We now learn that people will have to sell their homes, so it's another broken promise. Worse than that, it's that people who aren't so well off will have to sell their homes because, of course, many families won't have £86,000 to hand.
I'm glad to hear that he asserts that no one will lose out.
Quiet but explicit disapproval seems more likely than a thumping defeat. But
there's real cause on these benches about the distribution of the relative losses and the worry that those less well off are going to be hit hardest from the government's amendment tonight.
the Prime Minister's claim that his plan will fix social care could cause some political damage that needs fixing itself. Laura Gunsberg, BBC News, Westminster.
And we'll catch up with Laura at Westminster in just a few minutes. Before that, the latest on the economy. Economic growth must be evenly spread throughout the UK rather than concentrated in the southeast of England, according to the Confederation of British Industry. Speaking at the annual conference, the CBI's Director General, Tony Danker, said that levelling up could not be left to the free market. The Prime Minister told the same conference that levelling up was his moral mission and an economic imperative. But his speech, as we've seen, didn't entirely go to plan, as our business editor Simon Jack reports.
Economic prosperity has not been shared equally over the last 40 years. The government has promised new Tory voters in the north that will change, and he came to the port of Tyne to ask business leaders to help him do it.
In the end, it is you, it is business people who will fix this problem.
After famously rejecting business concerns over Brexit with a 4-letter dismissal, Boris Johnson has never, unusually for a Conservative leader, felt entirely comfortable with a business audience. His trademark riffs, this one on the motor industry.
EVs may not burble like sucking doves, and they may not have that rum, rum, rah, rah.
Were followed by losing his thread. Then his traditional swagger.
Forgive me.
When it was then time for the audience to feel slightly uncomfortable.
Forgive me.
Remember, this relationship has faced recent strains.
Forgive me.
This government has imposed tens of billions in new business taxes over the last year. How is that business friendly?
If you ask me, does the Chancellor want to go further and reduce burdens on taxpayers and business? Yes, of course he does. But don't forget, Simon, that we've just been through a pandemic. We will get to relieving more of the burdens on of taxation, but you've got to do it in a prudent and a reasonable way.
The conference was held over 8 venues. In Birmingham, Keir Starmer tried to reset Labour's ties with business after the nationalisation plans of the Corbyn era.
Sometimes, if I may say so, our party has come across as thinking that business is to be tolerated in some way, but not to be celebrated as a good in itself. And I think that mindset has changed under my leadership.
The government's asking a lot of the private sector. It wanted to do the lion's share of levelling up and decarbonising, which is a tall order for firms emerging into a post-COVID, post-Brexit world and facing higher taxes on profits and wages. Little wonder then that crucial business investment is still way down on where it was before the pandemic. Chris Ford was there to hear the Prime Minister's pitch. His family engineering business has been based near the port for over 100 years, but right now he remains cautious.
I think smaller businesses would like to invest, but are still uncertain when prices are rising across the board. So we're seeing material prices, raw material prices increase, labour costs and energy pricing going up across the board. So we're really a little bit uncertain about where we're going. So we're possibly not quite ready to make those investments just yet.
Business and government do agree they will need to work together to turn levelling up from a political slogan into an economic reality. Simon Jack, BBC News, South Shields.
Let's go live to Westminster then and talk to our political editor, Laura Kuenssberg. Laura, two things. What's at stake in this vote tonight, and what does the Prime Minister kind of think of things after today's events?
Well, Hugh, it's certainly been a difficult day all round for Downing Street. If we just take a look in the Commons chamber, you'll be able to see MPs just drifting back in for that result on that crucial change to the plans for social care in England. It would be a huge upset if the government actually loses on this vote. Remember, they've got a thumping majority of 80. But the fact that it's even a vague possibility that there might be a defeat in the Commons chamber tells you something. It tells you that there is a lot of concern on the Conservative benches about this particular plan, and that is, if you like, demonstrative of a wider problem. It's not just about this policy. We all know, our viewers will remember, Downing Street's had a very difficult couple of weeks with all those allegations of sleaze, the self-admitted mistake over the handling of one element of that, a big backlash last week to what in theory should have been a good announcement for them, those big plans for railways across the country. But in the words of one friend of Boris Johnson, a former cabinet minister, it looks like Number 10 just keeps getting things wrong. There is a lot of anxiety around. Downing Street would say that they've just got to get on with it. They are trying to do big, ambitious things, and of course there will be resistance. But there are problems. There is concern inside the Tory tent. But remember, it's far too early to say that if this is the start of something significant, or whether it's something to be expected, a form of the midterm blues.
Laura, many thanks again. Laura Kuenssberg there with her analysis at Westminster. Now, the energy company Bulb has become the largest casualty of the increase in wholesale gas prices, which has seen a number of smaller firms go out of business this autumn. The company, which has 1.7 million customers, has now called in the administrators. Because of its size, they will continue to run the business for the time being, and bill payers are advised not to take any action at this stage. An investigation by BBC News has found that two women who died of herpes could have been infected by the same surgeon working in Kent. The women died 6 weeks apart, within days of giving birth, of what is usually a mild infection. East Kent Hospitals Trust said that they could not identify the source of the infection, and the surgeon had no history of the virus. Our social affairs correspondent, Michael Buchanan, uncovered the story.
These two women, both new mothers, died 44 days apart. Their families were led to believe their deaths were not linked until now.
She was a real fun-loving girl, great personality, had lots and lots of friends.
In May 2018, Kim Sampson gave birth to a son, her second child.
She was a brilliant barber and an absolutely brilliant mum.
The 29-year-old had undergone an emergency caesarean delivery, but complications set in. The hospital didn't know why, and she died 19 days after giving birth.
We had kept being told everything was going to be okay after she had that first operation, but from then it just... And then she had a further operation after that because she was bleeding out from lots of places. There was nothing really they could do with her.
The trust told the family that Kim had died of herpes, a common, usually mild infection that's rarely fatal, but they couldn't say how she'd been infected.
They didn't really give us an explanation other than she may have come into close contact with someone who had a cold sore.
Following Kim Sampson's death, the trust say they told all maternity staff to take precautions against herpes infections. But just 6 weeks later, another woman became similarly ill.
They went on their honeymoon and I think she fell pregnant just after they got back.
And she wanted a child?
Oh, yeah, definitely. They'd always talked about having 3 children.
Samantha Mulcahy gave birth by caesarean section to her daughter in July 2018. The 32-year-old again quickly deteriorated, baffling medics, and died 8 days after giving birth.
I can remember right at the very end, even then, they said they were basically at a loss. They didn't know what was wrong.
The hospital said Samantha too had died of herpes. 2 rare deaths, but seemingly no link.
We were told there was no connection at all with the deaths.
But that turned out not to be the case. The trust quickly discovered the same surgeon had operated on both women. Documents we've seen show that just 2 weeks after the second death, they were told it does look like surgical contamination. Public Health England concluded the strain of the virus the women died of was rare and maybe epidemiologically linked.
Well, these are certainly very unusual cases, very rare indeed.
We shared the documents with Peter Greenhouse, a world-renowned expert on herpes infection.
The only common source here would be the surgeon who performed the operations. But if you think of the speed at which these women became unwell and the location of their infection, which was inside the abdomen, it does seem very much more likely, very much more biologically plausible that that was the original site of the infection.
Peter Greenhouse says the strongest likelihood is that the surgeon had a herpetic whitlow, a small, often unnoticeable sore on his finger, and that he unwittingly shed the herpes virus. Even though he was wearing surgical gloves, a study of caesarean sections found the gloves tear in more than 50% of operations, potentially allowing the virus to infect the women. We showed both families the expert's opinion.
That was the original site of the infection.
Does that make sense?
Yeah. I'm a bit sick listening to that. It makes me think even more that there's a problem.
In a statement, the East Kent Hospitals Trust said that following detailed testing and analysis, there was insufficient evidence to determine if the infection originated from the same source. They added that the surgeon had told them that he had no hand lesions or history of the virus. The women's babies both survived. Their families now want inquests into the deaths. Michael Buchanan, BBC News, Kent.
Police in the American state of Wisconsin have detained the driver of a vehicle which drove at speed into a Christmas parade in the city of Waukesha, killing 5 people and injuring nearly 50 others. The vehicle hit members of a marching band, and a local hospital says it's treated 18 children among the injured. Our correspondent Barbara Platt-Usher sent this report.
This little girl narrowly escaped with her life. She had no idea what was hurtling towards her. And here, the moment when the joy and festivity of the Christmas parade turned to horror and tragedy. A vehicle traveling at full speed struck members of a marching band. The driver continued forward, hitting and running over others in his path. These young dancers, perfectly in step one moment, the next, brutally disrupted. People, families, and children ran for their lives. Others tried to save those crumpled on the pavement.
It was just carnage, liking it to a war zone. There were adults, children that were injured. Some of our first responders were there with our families. They left their families to treat people, helped with instant command, helped transport. I just gotta know.
The suspect is a local man, Daryl Brooks, an aspiring rapper. He posted this video on his YouTube channel, including what looks like the red vehicle used in the hit and run. Court documents show he has a lengthy criminal record. Police said he had fled a domestic disturbance and that he had acted alone. But the result was devastating. This was the president's message to a community in mourning.
Last night, people of Waukesha were gathered to celebrate the start of a season of hope and togetherness and Thanksgiving. This morning, Jill and I and the entire Biden family, and I'm sure all of us, pray that that same spirit's going to embrace and lift up all the victims of this tragedy.
This afternoon, the police cordon came down and the road reopened.
But nothing feels back to normal. In the coming days, there will be opportunities to grieve and remember the victims together. But right now, the town is only just beginning to absorb the shock and loss. Barbara Platt-Usher, BBC News, Waukesha, Wisconsin.
Local authorities across the UK are to be told that they must accommodate some of the unaccompanied children who've been arriving in small boats across the English Channel. A voluntary scheme has not provided enough space, and some local authorities say that they're not happy to be forced to look after children without being given extra resources. Our Home Editor Mark Easton has joined me. Mark, what more can you tell us about this?
Well, the Home Office actually has long resisted a mandatory scheme which, as you say, would oblige councils across the UK to accommodate some of the unaccompanied children who've been arriving in such large numbers in small boats. But, with those record numbers in the last few weeks, ministers are now sending out letters to councils telling them that they must find homes for unaccompanied children unless there's a compelling reason why they should be exempted. Reaction from town halls? Well, Kent County Council, of course, the area where most of the children arrive, and they've been pushing for some time for a mandatory scheme. They're delighted because their children's services are already struggling to cope with the demand, and the hotels where up to 100, just over 100 children are currently housed, unaccompanied children, are deemed to be unsuitable. The association representing councils across England says most areas do support asylum-seeking children, but some would be under pressure, while the equivalent body in Scotland says it fears the mandatory scheme will not have a place-based research. There may be trouble ahead.
Okay, Mark, many thanks again. Mark Easton there with the latest for us. Now, Austria has returned to a full national lockdown because of its rising number of coronavirus infections. Austrians have been told to work from home and non-essential shops have been closed. At the same time, protests against new restrictions have been growing in several European countries, especially in the Netherlands and in Belgium. Our Europe editor, Katja Adler, has the latest.
COVID concerns are spreading across Europe. Spiralling case numbers are spooking some. Others, like this massive crowd in Vienna, object to COVID restrictions being reintroduced.
I'm a free Austrian who wants to be free and live free in this country.
Today, Austria became the first EU country to reimpose a full, if brief, lockdown. Vaccinations will be compulsory here from February. In Berlin, Germany's health minister said his country faced a national emergency. His choice of words caused some controversy.
Probably by the end of this winter, as it's sometimes cynically said, pretty much everyone in Germany will be vaccinated, cured or dead. That's how it is.
So what's gone wrong? The EU's huge headache at the beginning of the year was securing enough vaccines. Now it worries too few people have used them.
What we're seeing now, I think, is mostly driven by a lot of contacts between people coinciding with colder weather, a lot of indoor activities. The UK is following a different course. In the UK, you see that the numbers have been high for several months now, but they seem to be relatively stable, whereas in many other countries in Western Europe and Northern Europe, we've seen a steep increase in cases since October, which doesn't seem to happen in the UK.
An average of 60% of Europe is now fully vaccinated, but each country is different. The rate in Eastern Europe, for example, is far lower. The EU is now considering vaccinations for children over the age of 5. It approved jabs for the over 12s in May. The economic effects of COVID, those rising gas prices, people here in Europe say they're in need of some seasonal cheer, so no government wants to be seen to be cancelling Christmas, and that, they say, is why they're taking these COVID measures now. But what measures? Well, that varies from country to country and region to region. Bavaria has cancelled its Christmas market. Brussels is giving it a good go. The European Commission has nothing to say here because when it comes to health, each EU member state decides for themselves. This weekend, there were protests, some violent, against new COVID restrictions in Austria, Italy, the Netherlands, Croatia and Belgium. Pressure is mounting in Europe on the health services as well as the streets. The World Health Organization warns there could be 500,000 more deaths here by springtime unless effective action is taken. Katja Adler, BBC News, Brussels.
Let's get the latest figures on the pandemic here in the UK. In the past 24 hours, there have been nearly 45,000 new infections recorded, and that's just over 5,000 more than this time last week. On average, there were nearly 42,000 new cases reported per day over the past week. 45 deaths were recorded of people who died within 28 days of a positive COVID test. And on average in the past week, 147 related deaths were recorded every day. And on the vaccination front, 15.3 million people have now had their booster injection. The First Minister of Scotland, Nicola Sturgeon, and the leader of the Scottish Conservatives, Douglas Ross, have been on a joint visit to a drugs recovery group in what they call a united effort to tackle Scotland's growing drugs problem. The most recent figures show a record number of drug-related deaths in Scotland for the 7th year in succession, and Scotland has by far the highest rate of deaths related to drugs of any country in Europe. Our Scotland editor, Sarah Smith, has the story.
Drug abuse is killing more than 25 people a week in Scotland and ruining the lives of many, many more. The figures are the worst in Europe.
Were you worried Ryan would end up in a long prison spell?
Yeah, either prison or take his own life, that's it.
John's son struggled with life-threatening drug addiction for years, in trouble with the law, yet the family couldn't access rehab treatment until a charity, the Amy Winehouse Foundation, volunteered to pay for it.
He was begging for help. It was really frustrating. So I was trying to break it down to him and say, surely it costs less to put somebody into treatment than it does into prison. Where in treatment they might have a chance to turn their life about.
Ryan is now in recovery and has a full-time job. The dire drugs problem has united the First Minister and the Scottish Conservative leader at a drug recovery facility. But cross-party cooperation isn't easy. Meeting with former addicts, Douglas Ross and Nicola Sturgeon agree urgent action is required. In a policy U-turn, the Tory leader says he may now support an official consumption facility that would allow people to use illegal Class A drugs under supervision.
There is a united effort to deal with this national scandal. The fact that so many lives are being lost means there's no one got a monopoly on the solutions to this. We can come together from different political sides to come up with a solution that can really make a difference.
Drugs charities have long advocated that there should be a right to recovery. And now the Scottish Tories are proposing a new law that would give a legal right to treatment for any addicts who need it. Nicola Sturgeon says she is open to all ideas, including those proposals from the Conservatives, as she admits the problem's drastic.
I think the drugs death toll is unacceptable. I think it is shameful. I think we've got to turn it around. So I'm choosing not to be defensive about this. I'm choosing to be candid and say we've got to do much better. I've got to do much better. My government's got to do much better. And there's a serious determination to do that.
Boxing lessons are part of the recovery programme at this community centre. It's what all parties say they want to see more of, and may be prepared to set aside the usual political punch-ups to try and make it happen. Sarah Smith, BBC News, Glasgow.
Hundreds of people have turned out to pay tribute to the late Sir David Amess, whose funeral service was held in Southend today. Sir David, who was 69 and the MP for Southend West, was stabbed to death at a constituency surgery last month. There was a private family service, after which the funeral procession made its way through the streets of Southend, as Daniela Ralph tells us.
He died working for the people he served. Today, they came to say goodbye. Sir David Amess's coffin was borne by Southend firefighters. The streets were filled with his constituents, and local Sea Scouts lined the path into church. As a place he'd served for almost 40 years said farewell.
My son's actually in the 3rd Chalkwell Bay Sea Scouts.
He's one of the Sea Scouts outside.
That have come to represent. So yeah, it's just a really sad day.
It's touched a lot of people, whether they're into the same politics or not.
Took my grandson out of school today, this afternoon, so that he could also come pay respects as well.
Everything felt local. The sound of the church service was broadcast on BBC Radio Essex, and friend and former Conservative MP Anne Widdecombe spoke on behalf of Sir David's wife and children.
As a family, we are trying to understand why this awful thing has occurred. Nobody should die in that way. Please let some good come from this tragedy.
His final journey through Southend took him past his constituency office and the Civic Centre. The funeral mass will be in the grandeur of Westminster Cathedral tomorrow. But as it so often did for Sir David Amess, Essex came first. Daniela Ralph, BBC News, Southend.
Before we go, just a quick update on the vote on reforming social care in England in the House of Commons. Business still going on in the House of Commons right now, as we can see, but in the earlier vote, MPs did back Boris Johnson's social care plan, but it was by 272 votes to 246, and that is a much reduced Conservative majority of 26 votes. That's it, the latest in the Commons tonight. Now on BBC One, it's time to join our news teams where you are. Have a good night.
Hugh, thank you. Good evening and welcome to Monday's late edition of Look North. On the programme tonight, people living on the route of the now abandoned HS2 route in South Yorkshire say they're still living in limbo. And 101 miles in 24 hours as former Leeds Rhinos player Kevin Sinfield runs through the night